So recently, I directed a production of a play called Arden Everywhere, which is a reimagining of Shakespeare's As You Like It, a play I have always hated. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with As You Like It, the main character is a woman who dresses like a man, and there's love at first sight, and a lot of gallivanting in the woods with only moderately funny, goofy, rustic people, and at the end, everybody gets married. A less glib version of the plot would include the fact that there's been a coup and the people in the woods are there escaping political violence. Now, most productions of this play treat the people in the woods like they've just stepped out of the L.L. Bean catalog and are on their way to a picnic. And this is where they lose me. Because let's remember the people in the woods are living hand to mouth in the dead of winter, barely surviving. And if they go home, they're most likely going to be killed. So we have a name for people in this situation. We call them refugees. So a few years ago, I was having coffee with an actor friend of mine who was in a production of As You Like It. And I went off, I hate that play, L.L. Bean catalog, blah, blah, blah. Why aren't those people starving? I said, I want those people to be starving. Well, you know, she said, you could do the play that way. So we talked about what happens to the story if you take the stakes of the circumstances seriously. I loved this idea so much, I couldn't read the play for months. You know how when you want something to work so badly, you can't bear to look at it that closely? So Arden Everywhere, my reimagining of As You Like It as a story about refugees, did not come from my desire to save the world, or even because I had something important to say about the refugee crisis. It really started because I was trying to make friends with this play. But it turned out to be so much more. It took me more than 3 years, and it blew my world open. So when I first started working on the play, I didn't really know anything about refugees. I probably knew less then than you do right now, because this was before the summer of 2015, when Syria essentially emptied out and the refugee crisis made headline news all over the world. So I went to a lot of websites, I did a lot of reading, but my work is telling stories about people. And so pretty quickly it became clear that I needed to start meeting people and hearing about their experiences. I started to teach theater workshops in ESL classes, and one of the first ones that I taught was with a group that worked mostly with Russian immigrants. And I explained to the group that I was working on As You Like It, and I immediately get interrupted by an incredibly cranky elderly Russian lady who says to me, "There's no such play. I know all of Shakespeare, and I've never heard of it." So here I am trying to convince this woman who could be my grandmother that yes, in fact, the play does exist. Eventually, somebody looked it up on their phone, and in case you're interested in Russian, they call the play Orlando. Ugh, she said, it's a comedy. She thought I should be working on Hamlet. So as I talked to the people in the group about the play, I asked them, if you had to leave your home suddenly, what would you take with you? And really, there was only one answer. I would take my passport and my children. One woman was reminded of her experience as a young girl during World War II when the Nazis invaded her village, and she and her cousin ran away into the woods, and they spent the entire winter surviving only on frozen potatoes. So as I kept teaching, I thought I was going to get a lot of stories of the frozen potatoes variety, because I was, after all, working with people who had been through really hard things. But surprisingly, that is not what happened. Instead, when I asked people to play silly, goofy theater games, they were silly and goofy. And when I brought in parts of the play to work on, they were really focused on understanding what every word meant, just like we all are when we read Shakespeare. One summer, I was the junior high and high school theater teacher at a program for the kids of resettled refugee families. And I took the job because I really wanted to understand what refugee kids were like. And what I found was that the junior high students were surly and recalcitrant and didn't want to put their phones away. And the high school students were hormones for days. Basically, they were like teenagers everywhere. After a while, it became clear that in order for me to really learn what I needed to understand, I would have to go to where the refugees were before they got resettled. So I taught a 2-week theater workshop at Kakuma Refugee Camp in the northwest corner of Kenya, where I was blown away, not by the suffering that I saw, but by the sheer 3-dimensional humanity of the people that I worked with. Much more about that in a moment. So when I got back from Kenya, not long after I got back, I went to an immersive exhibit that was created by a really amazing international organization that provides medical care all over the world. They wanted to give people a taste of what it feels like to be a displaced person. And there were lots of video and lots of pictures, and I found the exhibit really moving, but there was something missing for me. And I think if I hadn't been to Kakuma, I wouldn't have even noticed it wasn't there. There was only one image of someone smiling. And I get it. I mean, this really amazing organization whose work I totally support was trying to raise awareness, but they were also trying to raise money. And images of suffering inspire people to open their wallets. As a photographer friend of mine who works with refugees a lot says, it's hard to avoid flies on eyes. So what's wrong with flies on eyes? Well, let me frame it for you a little bit differently. I want to ask you to take a moment to think about a time in your life where you've been through something hard, or something bad happened. How would you feel if the first thing that anybody knew about you was the hard thing that you just thought about? Nobody wants to be known based on the worst thing that has ever happened to us. And yet, that is exactly what we do with refugees. The problem with flies on eyes is that the cord that it plucks in us is pity. And pity is distancing. It shuts us down. It might make you open your wallet, but for most of us, it also inspires this little voice in our head that says, I couldn't survive that. How can that person survive that? I can't even stand to think about it for very long. So what's the alternative? If pity shuts us down, what opens us up, especially when we're confronted with someone who's been through something very hard? I think what we need to do is tap into our common humanity. The cord we need to pluck is empathy. And this is the lesson that I learned in Kakuma, where I was interacting with people not based on their suffering, but through creativity and imagination and play. When I first got there, the international organization that I was working with explained to me that there were 4 theater groups in the camp that had spontaneously emerged. And part of what they wanted me to do was to help these groups learn to do their work better. So very early on, I asked the people in my workshop, what was the hardest thing for them about making theater there? And I got the same answer over and over again. It's really hard for me that nobody in my community takes me seriously as an actor. Now, I can pretty much guarantee you that if I had been in a room with 40 actors in New York City, I would have gotten the exact same answer. I learned that the content of the theater that they made was driven primarily by the agendas of the international organizations that worked in the camp. And so I asked them to make plays that were based on stories that were important to them. The most memorable one was about a cheating husband who gets his comeuppance when his girlfriend and his wife conspire. It was hilarious. And it had nothing to do with being a refugee. I had thought that I was going to get to know the stories of the people in my workshop, but it turned out that most of them didn't speak enough English for that to happen. And so instead, I got to know them in all kinds of other ways that really sidestepped a lot of my assumptions about who they were. I learned that there's a really compelling reason why Congolese people are famous for being fashionable. They might be living in the middle of the desert with no access to running water or electricity, but that is not an excuse not to look good. They had hairstyles. They had outfits. There were 5 women in my group that brought their babies with them to the workshop. And one of them in particular was really adorable. And every day he would crawl around on the floor, flirting with everybody, really happy, until he got to me. At which point he would burst out crying. I think I was the only white person he had ever seen, and he was terrified. Everybody thought that was hilarious. Some of the best moments were on days when I was doing an exercise that required music, and so we would bring a generator and a speaker with us. And then whenever there was a break, somebody would plug in their phone, and they would dance. Now, I don't mean to suggest that the people that I worked with in Kakuma were happy to be there. Quite the opposite. They're essentially living in a city of 200,000 people with no infrastructure and no ability to work. All of them desperately want to be able to go home safely or else get resettled somewhere where they can build a life. And every one of them either has been through or is continuing to go through incredibly difficult things. But what I got from my students in Kakuma was a crash course in joy. I learned that joy is not the absence of hardship, but the joy and hardship live together in intimate proximity, cheek by jowl, and that no one is just their trauma history. And it is this point that every human experience that we all lay claim to is also happening for refugees. This idea is so absent from the conversation that most of us have access to about the refugee crisis that we don't even notice it's not there. So there's a talented but kind of obscure writer, performer you might have heard of, a guy named Lin Manuel Miranda. He wrote a show called Hamilton. So he calls theater an empathy machine. So it was this lesson in empathy that crystallized for me in Kakuma that now brings me back to As You Like It. So remember when I told you the plot, I mentioned there are some only moderately funny, goofy, rustic characters. When I first started working on the play, I didn't know what to do with them. I actually thought about cutting them because how do I tell a serious story about refugees with these goofy people wandering through all the time? And then I went to Kakuma and I discovered that the goofy rustic people are actually at the heart of what I'm trying to do, because they do take the play out of the realm of the serious but reductive and put it exactly where it needs to be, in a world of complexity and contradiction, where suffering and silliness bump up against each other at every turn. So how did we do this? Well, to begin with, we took the stakes of the situation seriously. Remember this version of As You Like It? That was supposed to be a really good production, too. Well, this was Arden everywhere. We had an amazing, diverse cast of both professional actors and non-professionals from the refugee and immigrant communities. And every choice we made, we kept in mind that our audience might not be fluent English speakers. They might not be in the habit of going to the theater, and they might not believe that Shakespeare was for them. We played soccer on stage. Everywhere I've ever been where there are refugees, there is soccer. It truly is the universal language. And we were lucky to find that 2 of our immigrant actors were genius soccer players, and they taught us what we needed to know. Jorge and George showed us the way. We had a character who spoke primarily in Spanish. We sang songs in Sinhalese and Swahili and Russian. And we created text where the non-American-born actors told stories about their own immigration experiences. And then at the end, we finished with a chorus of people speaking in Russian and Spanish and Sinhalese and Uzbek and Arabic. And finally, we were lucky to be hosted by Baruch Performing Arts Center, which connected me with the incredible CUNY community, the most amazingly diverse group of people I have ever been privileged to be part of. So, yeah, give yourself a hand. So, so why does all of this matter? It matters because most of us spend most of our time with people who are mostly like us. But when you and I go to the theater, we are connected by that experience. Even if we never talk to each other, we become part of a kind of temporary community that is forged by a group of people sitting together in a dark room listening to someone tell us a story. And because the people who are telling us the story are in the room with us, they're part of our community too. And most of us very rarely have an opportunity to be in community, even in this little way, with people who are different from us. And then when we do, the world looks different for a moment. And that is when the empathy sneaks in. There are more than 65 million displaced people in the world right now. It's the most at any time since the end of World War II. And yet the conversation that we're having in this country about the refugee crisis is paralyzed. On the one side, there are these overwhelming statistics of misery. And on the other side, there's a kind of nativist fear-mongering that wants us to believe that anyone from somewhere else is a danger. So how do we break that logjam? There are no simple answers. If it was easy, somebody would have fixed it by now. But what I have learned is that when we stop thinking about refugees as abstractions of suffering or danger and start to think of them as people like us, we start to think about things differently. Possibilities open up. So when I first started working on this project, I talked to the director of refugee services at a big community-based organization in Brooklyn where I live. And I was kind of apologetic about wanting to ask people who had been through so much to talk to me about this crazy 400-year-old play I was working on. But she set me straight. She said, no, tell them what you're working on. People like to believe that their experiences are Shakespearean. It's flattering. So I am using Shakespeare to try to redeem a seemingly hopelessly diminished conversation about the refugee crisis. And maybe this crazy 400-year-old play is exactly the corrective we need. It will do its work as an empathy machine so that when we look at refugees, instead of fear or pity, we can connect to the fundamental truth of our common humanity.